Welcome to the debate. So, I want you to imagine a truck. It is full of your company's highest margin product, and it stopped at the Polish border.
Right.
And it's not a customs issue. It is stopped because yesterday, your SAP system generated an invoice with an outdated tax code, and a government algorithm just rejected in real time.
Wow. Yeah.
So suddenly, a minor IT configuration error hasn't just caused an accounting headache, it has literally halted physical commerce.
And that right there is a terrifying new reality for enterprise IT and for finance teams, too. I mean, historically, an incorrect tax configuration meant an audit risk, 3 to 5 years down the line?
Exactly, yeah. You'd pay a fine and move on.
Right. You adjust your general ledger and just move on. But today, with this global shift toward continuous transaction controls, CTCs, governments are sitting right inside your transactional data flow.
They are, and the regulatory environment is changing at blistering speed. It forces this fundamental architectural question, which is, how do you design a financial system for an environment that never stops moving?
Right.
So today, we are examining the profound architectural shift required for tax configuration in modern SAP FI implementations. As global business enters this era of extreme mandate velocity, should detailed tax determination logic be completely externalized to a dedicated compliance platform? Or can a deliberately architected ERP-centric SAP model still provide the necessary agility without fracturing the entire financial system?
It is probably the single most consequential technical decision an enterprise architect will make about their compliance capability this decade.
No question.
But before we diverge on the solution, we should establish the one premise where we are in absolute lockstep, based on the material. The historical approach to this, what we might call the 2010 setup mentality, is completely dead.
Oh, totally dead. Treating SAP tax configuration as a mere setup task, something you just hand off to an FI consultant to configure a few tax codes and map them to GL accounts alongside profit center assignments, that is a catastrophic failure today.
Absolutely.
It creates this structural compliance debt that compounds every single year.
We are perfectly aligned there. I mean, the old way of configuring from the mandates that happen to be active on the day of go-live and just hoping the IT maintenance team can figure out the rest later, that guarantees massive remediation costs within, say, 18 months.
Easily.
So the disagreement between us isn't about whether we need a new approach. The disagreement is about what that new approach should actually be.
Right. And that brings us to our respective positions. I'll lay my cards on the table first. To survive this current era of mandate velocity and, frankly, the impending data requirements of enterprise AI, SAP must be fundamentally stripped of detailed tax logic.
Okay.
I am advocating for a minimal core. The operational environment has fundamentally changed. Embedding jurisdiction-specific rates, complex thresholds, and CTC validation rules inside SAP guarantees failure, because it requires expensive, slow development work for every single regulatory change. The only mathematically scalable solution is pushing all that detailed logic to a dedicated external compliance layer. SAP should merely classify the data, pass it over an API, and let a purpose-built engine do the determination.
And while I absolutely agree that the conventional, lazy setup approach creates fragile systems, I am sorry, but I just don't buy that externalizing the logic is the only or even the best solution.
Really?
Yeah. You do not need to hollow out SAP to survive mandate velocity. By employing deliberate design principles, specifically tax code minimalism, which prevents the proliferation of redundant tax codes, and abstractive modeling, which we'll dig into later.
Sure.
By doing that, SAP remains incredibly powerful. It acts as a highly resilient single source of truth. When you completely externalize this logic, you're trading internal configuration complexity for severe integration dependencies.
I wouldn't call them severe.
You are relying on a complex API contract operating at machine speed for every single financial transaction globally. An ERP-centric model carefully designed avoids the fragility of that massive external dependency.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective by bringing this down to a very practical reality, which is updating tax rates. VAT rates change, It is not a hypothetical risk, right? It is an absolute certainty.
Right.
Let's look at what actually happens mechanically. Governments change standard rates. They introduce temporary reduced rates for specific industries during economic crises, like we saw across Europe recently. And they abolish old rates. If you maintain a traditional ERP-centric architecture, you are likely maintaining those rates in condition records or legacy FT/XP entries.
Which, to be fair, is exactly how SAP was originally designed to function.
Yes, but think about the pain point that creates today. If you are relying on those legacy FT/XP entries, you are hard-coding specific rates directly to tax codes. When a global enterprise operates in 60 countries, the frequency of these rate changes is just staggering. Let's say Germany reduces VAT for hospitality. What happens? An IT ticket is logged. A developer goes in. A transport is created.
Yeah, the standard process.
Right. It moves to quality assurance. You have to run a full regression test to make sure you didn't accidentally break the billing for your manufacturing division, all while the business is actively trying to build customers.
Right.
The velocity is simply too high for that cycle. In a dedicated external compliance layer, updating a tax rate is practically a push-button exercise. That external engine is built to absorb that velocity without requiring system downtime in your core ledger.
I come at it from a different way. You are conflating bad ERP design with all ERP design.
How so?
Yes, hard-coding tax rates into FTXP entries is a disaster. I agree, but you do not need a third-party compliance engine just to update a VAT rate. What you need is centralized rate governance within the ERP.
Okay, but
If you design your condition tables properly, if you abstract the mathematical rate from the underlying tax code, you can update a parameter centrally without rewriting custom logic, without spinning up new tax codes, and without breaking the system. You are treating the external compliance platform as a magic bullet for rate management, when the real solution is just disciplined architectural design inside the system you already own.
wait, hold on. Let's talk about what that disciplined architectural design actually requires in practice. Are you expecting an already overworked SAP basis or FI team to manually govern and update VAT rates for 60 different countries every month without missing a beat?
Well, no, not manually.
Because practically speaking, that sounds like an operational nightmare. You're asking an IT infrastructure team to monitor global tax legislation at machine speed.
They shouldn't be monitoring it manually. They should be subscribing to automated tax rate updates that feed directly into SAP's condition tables. It is a structured data feed, not a manual keystroke exercise.
But even with a data feed, every time you inject new parameters into your core SAP configuration, best practices and audit controls dictate you must test the downstream impacts.
Sure, testing is required.
The core ERP is not the place to be constantly swapping out variables. An external layer completely quarantines that legislative risk away from your financial bedrock.
Regression testing is a reality of enterprise software, absolutely. But okay, let's say you push that logic out to an external engine. Managing the rate percentage is really only half the battle. Let's look at the immediate consequences of the transaction lifecycle.
Okay.
You argue that externalizing the determination logic reduces risk. I argue it creates more risk, specifically because of the API contract.
Wait, how does relying on a specialized compliance engine create more risk?
Because SAP doesn't get a free pass just because you bought an external engine. Even if you offload the final rate calculation, SAP still has to generate perfect, pristine data to feed into that external platform's API.
Right. Classification is needed.
Think about the payload required. SAP line items must carry transaction identifiers, perfectly validated business partner data, VAT registration numbers, destination logic, commodity codes, and physical versus digital supply indicators.
Right.
If your SAP configuration must execute 95% of the hard work just to classify all of this data perfectly to formulate the API payload, why wouldn't you just let SAP execute the final mathematical determination? You're already doing the heavy lifting. But by sending it over the wall, you are introducing network latency, API timeouts, and the risk of data loss or mapping errors across two completely different systems.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it ignores what happens after the calculation. It comes down to testing and error workflows in a CTC environment.
Okay, how so?
Let's use Italy's SDI portal or Poland's KSEF mandate as an example. When you generate an invoice, the government platform validates it in real time. Adequate testing today doesn't just mean checking if your internal SAP configuration mapped to the right GL account.
Right.
It means testing against the actual live validation schemas of those government portals. When a transaction is rejected by the Italian government in real time, who handles it? The external compliance layer natively handles the error workflows, the data enrichment, and the resubmissions. It is literally built for regulatory exception handling.
But why is a transaction being rejected by the Italian government in the first place?
Because government algorithms are complex, schemas change, or a specific permutation of data wasn't formatted exactly how the mandate required that week.
No, usually it's rejected because of bad master data. A missing VAT number, an incorrect partner type, a malformed address field, and this is exactly where deliberate SAP design is vastly superior.
Superior how?
There is a critical design principle regarding master data governance. It must be embedded directly into configuration. You are talking about exception handling when transactions are rejected. I'm talking about preventing the rejection entirely.
But you can't prevent every.
If you configure SAP workflows to ensure fields are rigorously validated before a customer or vendor master record is even released for use, the transaction won't fail the government validation. You are using the external engine's exception handling as an expensive safety net for sloppy internal master data governance.
I wouldn't call it a safety net.
If you fix the root cause inside SAP, the ERP-centric model works flawlessly. You don't need to turn a foundational financial ledger into a government API gateway because the data was right to begin with.
It's not just about sloppy master data, though. Governments change their XML requirements constantly, and an external engine insulates you from having to rebuild those XML generation workflows inside SAP.
Well, they do change, yes.
But let's broaden the scope here. Let's move beyond just the immediate transaction lifecycle and look at the long-term evolution of the business. Organizations don't stay static. We have mergers, acquisitions, entirely new service lines.
Right.
If you rely on an ERP-centric architecture, how do you handle a massive pivot in your business model without the internal tax configuration just cracking under its own weight?
Beautifully, if you use what we call abstractive modeling. The fatal flaw of the conventional 2010 setup approach is that it only handles the transaction types and material classifications that exist on day one.
Exactly.
When a company acquires a new division or pivots from selling physical hardware to selling digital subscriptions, the old rigid logic breaks. Consultants panic and they start spinning up dozens of new tax codes and applying manual overrides.
Right. Tax code proliferation. It's a disease in legacy SAP environments.
Exactly. But abstractive modeling cures it. It is the ultimate future-proofing tool.
Okay, walk us through exactly how that works mechanically, because abstracting sounds great in a boardroom, but how does it work in the system?
Mechanically, it means you stop configuring logic tightly coupled to a specific physical product. Instead of creating a highly specific tax code for SaaS data storage in France, you create a broad conceptual bucket in SAP, something like digital services B2B standard rate.
Okay.
That is your determination framework. When your company acquires a new software firm 2 years later, you don't call an IT team to build new tax logic. You don't rewrite the underlying SAP plumbing.
You just map it.
Exactly. You just point the new company's products into that existing conceptual bucket. The business reality maps to the abstraction. By doing this, you absorb immense business complexity into existing logic with minimal configuration changes. You don't need a massive external system to handle a new business model. You just need an SAP architecture that was forward-looking enough to model the range of business activities the organization might undertake.
Right.
It's elegant, it's contained, and it maintains SAP as the unshakable single source of truth.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently when we look at where enterprise technology is actually heading, and we have to talk about artificial intelligence.
Of course.
Enterprise AI and advanced data intelligence demand clean, canonical, standardized data. These AI systems need to ingest a massive volume of global financial transactions at machine speed to generate actionable insights.
And SAP is the perfect structured repository for that data.
But not if it's full of deep, customized, abstractive mappings. Let me offer a different analogy. Think of traditional SAP tax logic like a hardwired sound system in a house.
Okay.
If you want to add a speaker in the kitchen or change how the audio routes, you have to literally tear open the drywall. Pushing tax logic to an external compliance layer is like switching to a smart wireless ecosystem.
Right.
SAP just provides the Wi-Fi signal, the pure transaction data, and the external engine handles exactly how and where the complex tax routing happens. You never have to punch a hole in your ERP's drywall again.
But with abstractive modeling, I'm arguing you've built standard ports into the wall from day one. You just plug into them.
Even so, you're forcing new business realities into old abstract frameworks just to keep the internal tax engine happy. Here is the core of the issue. Tax law is inherently political, while financial data must be mathematical.
That's a bold claim.
If you build dense tax determination logic into SAP, you are polluting a pure mathematical system with political chaos. Governments make arbitrary, illogical tax rules to win elections, not to create elegant data structures.
Well,
A minimal SAP core produces the clean, standardized, machine-readable data that AI absolutely demands. It keeps the financial ledger mathematically pure. The external compliance platform is designed to handle the messy, convoluted, and inherently illogical reality of global tax regulations.
right.
It acts as a quarantine. Why would you expose your pristine financial data model to political logic when you could cleanly separate the two?
I wouldn't call abstractive modeling pollution. I would call it structural integrity. By keeping it inside SAP, you maintain absolute control over the data lineage.
But you risk the integrity.
But I will concede this. The data demands of enterprise AI require a level of standardization we haven't seen before. If the API contract is flawlessly executed, yes, an external layer can isolate that regulatory chaos. But my warning remains. The moment that API contract degrades, the moment there is a mapping failure between SAP and the external engine, your AI is reading corrupted, misclassified data anyway.
Sure, failures happen.
And debugging a failure across two massive enterprise systems is exponentially harder than debugging an abstractive model inside a single SAP instance.
And I think that brings us to the crux of the issue. We are fundamentally talking about two very different philosophies for managing complexity over a 10-year horizon. My stance is that the sheer velocity of CTC mandates, where governments can literally halt your supply chain in real time, coupled with the rigorous data demands of enterprise AI, make a heavy SAP tax configuration inherently unsustainable. The operational risks are simply too high. Therefore, the SAP core must be minimal. It should serve as a pristine data classification engine that feeds a robust, dedicated external compliance layer built specifically to absorb global regulatory chaos at scale.
And my stance remains that while the regulatory environment is incredibly unforgiving, a deliberately designed ERP-centric architecture is more than capable. Through strict tax code minimalism, rigorous master data governance embedded at the configuration level, and the forward-looking application of abstractive modeling, SAP can elegantly manage this complexity.
Right.
This approach preserves a unified system architecture, keeps the data lineage intact, and avoids the massive, hidden fragility that comes with relying on API contracts for core financial determinations.
Regardless of which philosophy an organization adopts, I think it's important to highlight where we absolutely agree, because it is the most critical takeaway for anyone listening who is currently architecting these systems.
Absolutely.
Whether you choose the minimal core path or the ERP-centric path, tax configuration can no longer be an afterthought. It must be elevated to a blueprint priority during the initial design phase of any SAP implementation.
Completely. It requires active, integrated collaboration with indirect tax specialists from day one. You cannot leave this to a standard functional FI consultant whose only exposure is basic general ledger setup. The financial and operational stakes are just too high.
Yeah.
Furthermore, I think we both vehemently agree that tax code proliferation, letting implementation partners spin up hundreds of undocumented redundant tax codes for every edge case, is a catastrophic failure. It must be governed out of existence.
Absolutely. Letting tax codes proliferate is like laying that concrete foundation but letting every worker mix their own batch of cement with whatever water and sand they happen to find.
Right. It might look like a solid foundation on the day you go live, but it will crack under the pressure of the very first regulatory schist.
Designing enterprise systems that must operate flawlessly for a decade requires recognizing what sort of ground you are building on. For our listeners evaluating their own implementations, the question isn't whether your tax configuration happens to work today. The question is whether you are unknowingly building a deferred liability that will fracture the first time a global mandate changes. We'll leave it to you to decide which architectural approach provides the resilience your business actually needs.